Hi, it's Miles here at Fabricana. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we're going to be showing you how to make this classic witch hat. We've done it in this really fun and kind of fashion-forward gold color. If you've done any shopping recently, you'll see this color in the stores everywhere. It's not necessarily a color that I can wear. I'm kind of better with like the darker browns and golds. But if you can wear this beautiful gold, I would highly encourage it. You'll be the envy of all your witch friends. Part of this video is going to show you how to read a pattern. We're going to look at the layout, how to find your pattern pieces, all of the other information that's included in a pattern. So if you're new to sewing, this is a really helpful video for you. We have lots of other video content on our YouTube channel, so we encourage you to subscribe, turn on notifications so you'll know about any new upcoming videos. We're also on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook. And we encourage you to watch for our upcoming online store. I know you're anxious to start doing some sewing and cutting, but before we do that, let's take a look at all the materials that we're going to need for our project. Now, I've picked up this McCall's pattern. It's M7225, and I'm doing the adult size. So this will kind of direct us as to a lot of the other materials that we need, including some interfacing. This will make our hat nice and stiff. It'll make the point stand straight. It'll make the brim stay flat. We're using fusible interfacing. The pattern directions actually show sew-on interfacing, so I'll try and remember to make the adjustments for the our methodology. I'll explain how to use sew-on interfacing, but we will be using fusible interfacing. I've got a couple of embellishment ribbons that I'm going to use around the hat. I've got a nice black grosgrain and a nice kind of minty velvet ribbon, and I have matching thread for those so that we can sew them on without seeing the thread. I'm keeping a little bit of 1-inch wide elastic handy just in case your hat turns out to be a little bit too big. You can always stitch some elastic to the inside of your hat to make it a bit snugger. There's not going to be any instructions in the pattern for this, but I think it's just kind of a handy thing to have. I know for me it's probably not going to be a problem because I have a huge head, but if you do have a smaller head and you want it to fit snugly, the elastic may help. Some other supplies that we need: I've got some sewing pins, I've got some scissors for cutting out the fabric, and I used my paper scissors to cut out my tissue. It's a good idea to have separate scissors for your paper. You don't want to damage your sewing scissors with cutting fabric or paper. The other final thing that we're looking at is the main fabric, and you're maybe looking at this thinking it's a pretty wacky color, but really we want to do a fashion witch. So I've got this beautiful golden cotton velvet. Now, one thing I want to talk about with velvet is it's a nap fabric. So if I hold it up like this, kind of folding it over, I hope you can see on the camera that this part here has a beautiful kind of shadowy effect, and the nap, the pile of the fabric, feels smooth as I run my hand up the fabric, and down below it's kind of shinier. The color's a little bit brighter, not as rich, and that means that the nap is smooth as I run my hand down it. So I actually prefer the nice shadowy rich color that I'm getting here, so I want to make sure that I've got the fabric going in the right direction when I lay out my pattern pieces. So I hope that's a little bit of helpful information if you've also decided to use a velvet for your hat. Of course, if you're using a non-nap fabric, that's not going to be an issue, but if you are using a velvet, make sure that you've got it laying the right way. So when you're opening your pattern for the first time, let's find out what's inside. Slide it out. So of course, the main bulk of what you're going to find inside is all of your tissue paper, and these are the actual physical pattern pieces that you're going to need for your project. The other thing you're going to find are 2 or 3 kind of instruction sheets. So I'm going to find the first one here, and that is page 1. And what you're going to find on page 1 is all of the visuals for what is actually included in the pattern. So we're going to look at page 1 this is of 6, but we're just going to focus on page 1. And the first thing we're going to see is an illustration of all of the projects that are included in the pattern. We're specifically interested in hat A, so we know that's included in this pattern. And then if we open up the sheet a little bit more, we're going to see directly below that all of the pattern pieces that are included to make those projects. And again, because we're interested in hat A, if I look at the bottom of the sheet, it shows for hat A, we need piece 6, the hat, and piece 7, the brim. So once we know what pattern pieces we need, we're now going to go to the cutting layout section of our pattern. And again, I go to the project I'm interested in, and that's the hat. And it says again that I need pieces 6 and 7. It'll indicate the width of the fabric that we're using, or that is included in the layout. We're actually using a narrower fabric, but this layout works for 72-inch wide fabric. And then the actual illustration shows us how the pattern pieces get lined up for the most efficient use of our fabric. Another really useful part of the intro to our pattern is all of the information that's at the top of the pattern, including pattern markings, and that gives us kind of a key on how the pattern is marked with things like the grain line, fold line, cutting line, all of the information that we need to be able to interpret our pattern pieces. The next thing it's going to show is how to adjust our pattern pieces. You may need to make them a little bit shorter or lengthen it, and that explains here how to do that. The next section is cutting and marking. It gives lots of really good advice on how to pre-treat your fabric, how to work with different layouts and double thicknesses, single thicknesses, all that kind of information is going to be in the cutting and marking section. And finally, on the right-hand side, although a lot of the sewing information is given in further instructions, this will show you a little bit more information on the basics of how this project is going to be sewn. So once you've had a look at all of the things on your first page, I just want to point out that the rest of your instructions are all going to be about how to actually make that specific garment, about sewing and clipping and trimming and pressing and applying trims and things like that. So just know that the rest of the instruction sheets are all of the kind of how-to of making it step by step. So for our project, like I mentioned, we're making hat A. So I'm going to go to the instruction sheet for the hat. And I'm going to get that ready. And it'll show me everything from start to finish of how to finish making the hat. So we've talked about the instruction sheets. Now let's actually take a look at some of our tissue. It's a little bit noisy, so we don't want to make too much noise with the tissue. So aside from our instruction sheets, there's actually a lot of information included on the tissue. And one of the main things we're going to look at is you're going to notice that there's a lot of kind of duplicated lines, and those indicate various sizes. So the smallest line will indicate the small, then we have a medium, large, and extra large. So you need to know from the back of your pattern what size you're making, and then you'll cut or trace on that line. So once we know we've got the right size selected for our tissue, there's a lot of other information on the tissue that's also very helpful. The first one, and it's a very important part of sewing, is the grain line. And that's going to be indicated by a solid line with a couple of arrows at the other end. And that indicates that that pattern piece needs to line up with the selvage. The finished edge of your fabric has to run parallel to that line. Other information that we're going to find on our tissue, for this pattern in particular, you're able to shorten it for the miss sizes, and you'll just bring those two lines together. If you're making it for somebody who has extra long arms, this is a sleeve piece. It's indicating where to cut the pattern in order to make it a little bit longer. Some other really helpful things that you have are little dots that indicate match points on other pattern pieces, so that you'll want to match up the circles when you're sewing. Other match points will be indicated by little triangles like this. A lot of people wonder what these triangles are, and basically you want to make sure that when you're cutting out your pattern piece, you include the triangles so that you can perfectly match your match points when you're sewing. Some other things that you'll find if we look at the bottom here, it indicates the hem allowance. There's a lot of information again at the top of the pattern indicating the style number, indicating how many pieces we need to cut out of the main fabric. It indicates the sizes, and there's a piece number, again for our hat purposes. We're using pieces 6 and 7. This is piece 5, it's a sleeve for the tunic. And I think that's about all the information we're going to take from the tissue. So always take the time to read your tissue because there's a lot of information there as well. So as you may have noticed in your pattern, and I mentioned before, the layout that's given in our pattern is actually for a 72-inch wide fabric because they're assuming that we're making our hat out of felt. But we've chosen to use this beautiful cotton velvet, which is a little bit narrower, so the layout provided by the pattern won't work with the 60-inch fabric. So what we need to do, because all of the pieces are cut on folds, if we try to lay out all of our pieces on the fold, we wouldn't actually have enough fold space. So we have to create new folds in order to accommodate all of the pattern pieces. So I'm going to open up my fabric. Keeping the nap in mind, as I mentioned before, we have, and it feels smooth going this direction, so that's going to be the top of our hat, and that's going to be the bottom. That'll be very important for the big triangle piece, so we get that nice rich kind of shadowy effect of the velvet. The first pieces I'm going to kind of cut out though are the brim, and that piece gets cut on the fold. I'm just going to fold it so that I have just enough fabric to cut out that piece. The pattern indicates that this section is cut on the fold, so I'm going to line that edge up to the folded edge of my fabric. And I'm going to pin it in place. And I'm going to continue doing all of those pins, and then I'll be able to cut out this piece, and then I can show you the layout for the next one. So once we have piece 1 cut out of our hat, and we need to cut 2, we're going to make the same fold at this edge of the fabric. I'm going to reuse my pattern piece. This time I have to flip it kind of so that the text is actually facing down. So that'll give me a mirror image of the piece that I just cut out. And I'm going to do exactly the same process. I'm going to line up my where it indicates the center front fold along the new fold line. I'm going to place pins and I'm going to cut that out. The final thing that I need to do, and with the leftover piece, I'll be able to fold my fabric in half again, create basically the center front fold. I'm going to take the main hat piece, and you'll find indicating the top of our hat like that. We will be able to pin again on the fold. We're going to match that up, pin, and we're going to cut out our hat, making sure that we include all of the notches in our cutting. So once we cut out the pattern pieces in our main fabric, we also need to cut out the pieces in our interfacing. Now, if we just fold our interfacing along the length and lay out our pattern pieces, again, putting the pieces on the fold, we're going to be wasting a lot of the interfacing and just kind of leaving us with small scraps. So what I recommend is kind of offsetting the fold so that the amount of fabric that you're using, the amount of interfacing, is just what you need. So if we create a new fold, kind of about 1/3 of the way from the edge, and again we're going to be cutting 2 pieces of the brim. With the interfacing, you don't have to worry about the nap or the direction. And then I'm going to lay out the main part of the hat. And again, I might need to change the fold in order to allow for the pattern, that pattern piece, but that'll give us leftover interfacing that's much more usable. So I'm going to go ahead, pin my pieces and cut them out, and then I'll meet you at the ironing board to apply the interfacing. So here we are at the ironing board. I've got one piece of my brim. I've got the velvet side facing down to my ironing board. We don't want to damage the velvet. And I've got one of the pieces of interfacing for the brim. It's not quite cut out perfectly. And I'm going to be placing, like I said, we're using fusible interfacing, so I'm going to put the glue side of my interfacing that I can feel. It's got little glue dots. That's going to be facing the back of my fabric. So I'm going to be matching up the little notches. I mentioned the notches were important. I'm going to match that up on the pattern pieces. I'm going to start pressing the interfacing to my fabric. I've got my iron set to a wool setting, and that will melt the glue and help the interfacing stick. Now just be careful when you're pressing interfacing that you don't slide the iron around. A lot of people would want to do that, just like you're normally ironing, but you really do just have to kind of press and lift, and then move the iron to the next position that you want to fuse. And hold it for about 5 to 10 seconds, and that will activate the glue and make the interfacing stick to your fabric. So I'm going to continue applying the interfacing to the other brim piece and the other main part of the hat, and then we can start sewing. So we've got our instruction sheet here, and as you can see with hat A, it says we're going to base the interfacing to the wrong side of our hat. So if you have a sew-on interfacing, please do that. You're going to use a long basting stitch to apply the interfacing all the way around the pieces of the hat. We've already fused our interfacing to our hat, so we can move on to the actual sewing. The next thing it shows is applying the interfacing to the brim. So the first bit of sewing actually happens at the brim. It says stitch seam in each brim section, cut interfacing close to stitching. So I'm going to grab one hat section, and what they're showing in the illustration is that we fold the piece in half on that fold that we originally used, and we're going to be stitching that seam where we've got our nice little triangles to match up the seam. If you want to put pins in, you can. If you're new to sewing and you're nervous about stitching without pins, please put pins. If you're working with velvet, keep in mind velvet tends to kind of want to slide around a little bit too, so you may want to use pins. I'm not going to. It's a pretty short seam. I think I can hold it while it's sewing. I'm going to put my presser foot down. I'm going to back stitch. I'm using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's indicated by the pattern. I'm going to back stitch at the end of the seam. Trim my thread. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the second piece of the brim. So what I've actually done now is I've taken the large hat piece, folded it in half, matched up my notches again, and stitched that seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. The next thing I need to do is grab some scissors. I need to trim this little corner off. If we're going to be turning this inside out, we don't want all of this seam allowance to be in the way. So quite close to our stitching, we're going to trim that little corner off. And then we've got all of these bulky seam allowances. So we're going to grade those seam allowances. So I'm going to trim one of them fairly close to the stitching. This makes the project a little bit less bulky. We're going to have to sew this piece to the brim pieces. So if we have these bulky seam allowances, that makes that a little bit more difficult. So once we have both of our brim pieces with the seams pressed open, I'm actually going to trim the seam allowances of one of the brims so that when we stitch them together and turn them right side out, that seam isn't quite as bulky. And then we need to match up. We're going to be stitching the outside edge of the brim. So we're going to match up that seam along the edge that we're going to be sewing. I'm actually going to place pins here because this is a much longer seam and I want to make sure everything is lined up nicely. So if I match up the notch in the center of the brim and lay it smooth, I know that the edge of the brim is matched up as well. I'm going to place another pin. I'm going to go around, do that on the other side, matching that notch at the center, laying it flat. So put in as many pins as you feel you need to so that nothing moves while you're sewing. So once we've got all the pins in place, I'm going to start sewing kind of right at that seam. We're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge. Make sure to remove the pins as you go so you don't stitch over a pin. So once we've stitched our two brims together, it says grade seam allowances by cutting to graduated widths and interfacing close to stitching, clip curve. So what that means is just like we graded the one seam here, we're going to grade one of the seam allowances, just the top layer, down to a pretty small seam allowance. I'm doing about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to do that all the way around the brim. But also, because we've been stitching a curve, in order to turn this inside out, we actually need to clip into the seam allowance all the way around the hat as well. So I would do that once you've graded the one seam, then you're going to make clips in the other seam allowance in order for everything to lay flat once the pieces have been turned inside out. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll meet you with the iron to turn it inside out. So we have done our trimming our seam allowances, grading the seam allowances. We're ready to turn this inside out because the next instruction says turn right side out, press, baste raw edges together, to stay stitch raw edge of brim, machine stitch a 1/2 inch from raw edge, clip to stitching. So the first part of that instruction is we need to turn the whole thing inside out through the center. It's really stiff because we're using a nice stiff interfacing. We want the brim to really stand out when it's finished. It's almost like sewing with cardboard. I'm really going to try and open the seam as I turn it inside out. It'll make pressing much easier. Just kind of get my fingers in there, kind of rolling that seam out. So we're going to kind of use our fingers to kind of roll that seam all the way out. And we're going to press. I'm using a cotton velvet, so I have my iron set at a cotton setting. So because I'm working with a velvet, it's nice to press actually in the direction of the nap so that the iron isn't creating any kind of bubbles and puckers and little pleats. So try and press in the direction of the nap if you can. So I'm going to continue doing this pressing, and then I'm going to meet you at the sewing machine for the next step. It says that we need to stay stitch the pieces together at the center with a 1/2 inch seam. So I'll meet you at the sewing machine to do that. So we finished pressing all of those edges of our hat. Now we're going to stay stitch the inner portion. This will make it much easier to stitch the brim on because it'll hold these two layers together. So we're going to match up our little notches again. And like the pattern says, we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance so that we don't need to remove the basting when we're actually doing the actual sewing. because it's not going to show. If you want to, you can go to a longer stitch length. I'm just going to leave it as it is because, like I said, the sewing is staying in. We're not going to remove the basting. So the other nice thing about stay stitching is because this whole seam is pretty much on the bias, which tends to want to stretch, the stay stitching will help keep it from stretching, so it's much easier to apply to the hat. I've just stitched right off the edge there. I'm not bothering with any back stitching because this isn't really holding anything strong. And that's the stay stitching, and then we can move on to applying the brim to the main part of the hat. So before we turn our kind of hat inside out, we've pressed the seam open as far as we can. I didn't want to make any press marks right at the tip. I've got a wooden knitting needle. Maybe you have a point turner at home. Basically something that has kind of a little bit of a blunt edge. We don't want to damage our fabric, but we need to be able to turn that point to a nice sharp point. So I'm going to kind of pull the brim through, or the hat through. And I can work a lot of it out just by pulling the fabric through with my fingers. Even my knitting needle kind of wants to go through. So hopefully you have a nice blunt point turner like that. That's a pretty good point. And then we can finish turning it inside out. And then we will look at how we're going to pin the brim to the hat. One thing we haven't yet done to the brim is in the instructions it shows that we need to clip into the seam allowance of the brim, and that'll make it so it's a little bit easier to maneuver as we're stitching the hat. So as you can see, once we've made all those clips, the brim will be much more malleable and we'll be able to stretch it around the hat. So now we are ready to apply the main cone part of our hat to the brim. So as you can see, we've got the seam that goes up the back and we've got the seam on the brim that goes up the back. So we're going to match those 2 points together. It's a really odd little illustration in the instructions, but that's exactly what they're doing here. You can see they're matching the back seam of the brim to the back seam of the cone section. We're going to put a pin at that point. We've got our other match points that are the little triangles. So we've got one triangle on the cone section, one on the brim section. We're going to match those up. And once you've applied your pins, you will find that it looks a lot more like the little diagram. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. And then once we have those pins in place, we're going to stitch from the inside of the hat. So our press-it foot is going to be going down onto the back of the cone section of the hat. So we're going to get the hat in there. We're taking a 5/8 inch seam allowance through all layers, the 2 layers of the brim, the 1 layer of the cone. If you want to base this in place, that's not a terrible idea. This is probably the most difficult operation of this project. Kind of flattening it with your fingers as you go. We want to avoid puckers if we can. Remove it from the machine, trim the thread. And now I want to talk to you about some elastic options. So as you can see, this big long seam that we just stitched, that's all clipped and everything, it's a little bit ragged. And also, now is the time to try your hat on. If you find it's a little bit big for you, I'm going to suggest that you can pin some elastic, make that edge of the elastic line up with your stitching line, and then you can stitch close to that. Maybe like pull your elastic slightly as you're sewing, and that'll give a little bit of tension on the inside of the hat so it'll fit your head better. Another option, if you are fine with the size of your hat, you can always, if you have a serger available, you can serge all of those layers together to make a little bit more clean finish. Or if you don't have a serger, you could also go with your zigzag stitch over those raw edges. So whatever you choose to do at this point, please do elastic, serged edge, or a zigzag stitch. Or you can just be happy that it's a costume and leave it exactly as it is. So here we have our perfectly good basic witch hat. We did personalize it already with this beautiful gold color in a very luxurious velvet, but there's lots of fun ways you could continue to embellish it and personalize it even more. It could be really fun with some silver stars, maybe some little gold moons, black cats. I think tulle could be a really fun way to embellish it. You could use tulle or netting to create a veil, or maybe something kind of draping down the back. So please, use your imagination to your heart's content to find the way to personalize it for yourself. The way that we're going to personalize it is we've taken this beautiful wide black grosgrain ribbon, and we've also taken this lovely minty colored velvet ribbon. So we've got velvet on velvet. We're going to machine stitch the velvet to the grosgrain ribbon, and then I'm going to hand stitch this to the hat. I promise to show you a finished version of our hat once we've got it personalized. Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you have a chance to try a project like this. We hope that you've enjoyed seeing exactly what the instructions look like in the pattern and how those translate to how you make your pattern. It looks a little bit like a gold pylon, but of course it's a really fun fashion witch hat. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this video. We hope to see you again on our YouTube channel, and please follow us on Facebook and Instagram and watch for our upcoming online store.